She was 19 and homeless. No suitcase, no room key, no winter coat, just her father's old engraving knife and $11 she had kept folded in the back of a hymn book since the morning after the funeral. And with that $11, she bought a Scrimshaw studio forgotten along New Bedford's South Water Street in Bristol County, Massachusetts, a place that had fallen off working harbour maps in 1914. Rain came through the north corner of the roof. The back sill had softened black under the windows. The county had condemned it since 1987 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the bottom left drawer of the whale-tooth bench, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 100 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Willa Mae Hart had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had learned early that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. Waiting was holding still while a blade found its line. Waiting was keeping bread wrapped in a dish towel until the soup was ready. Waiting was listening at the edge of a room where adults spoke low, and understanding from the way a cupboard door closed that money had become thin again. She was born in a narrow rental house 3 blocks inland from the New Bedford waterfront, where gulls cried over roofs before dawn and the air changed with the tide. The front steps were painted grey each April by her father, because he believed a house should be given one decent thing a year, even if it did not belong to you. The paint always peeled by October. Salt found its way into everything. As a child, Willa liked the back room best. It held the steadier light. Her father kept a green desk lamp there, a jar of black ink, cotton cloths washed to the softness of old flour sacks, and a row of tools wrapped in a strip of sailcloth. He let her sit beside him after supper, when the dishes were drying in the rack, and the city buses hissed at the corner. He did not teach with many words. He placed things in her hand. A smooth scrap of bone, a dull needle, a small square of pumice. He would tap the table once when she pressed too hard, twice when she hurried, 3 times when she needed to stop and look before making the next cut. By the time she was 12, she could polish a curved piece of ivory substitute until lamplight spread over it like milk. By 14, she knew how to rub ink across a scratched line and wipe the surface clean until a ship appeared where there had only been pale silence. Her mother, Elise, was a woman who moved carefully around disappointment. She had once sung in the church choir with a voice people remembered, but by Willa's childhood she sang only while ironing. She kept receipts tucked in old envelopes, smoothed gift wrap to use again, and made apologies before anyone asked for them. When the refrigerator motor rattled, she put one hand against the door as though comforting an animal. Willa loved her with the cautious love children give to a parent who is always listening for another person's mood. Her father, Jonah Hart, was different in the way weathered wood is different from painted trim. He had no shine in him, but he held. He was broad through the shoulders, with patient brown eyes and hands marked by little half-moon cuts. People brought him broken watch cases, cracked knife handles, bone buttons from sailors' chests, anything small enough to be saved by skill and not money. He worked at a repair counter near the harbour 3 days a week and took private commissions when they came. To Willa, he seemed like the last man in town who still knew how to make silence useful. He told her once that his father had said New Bedford was built on oil, grief, and careful hands. The oil had left, the grief had stayed, and the careful hands were harder to find every year. He said this without bitterness, turning a piece under the light. His voice did not accuse the world, it only named it. On Saturdays, they walked to visit his aunt, Miriam Bell Hart, in a weathered apartment over an unused chandlery near Johnny Cake Hill. Miriam was not truly Willa's aunt, but in families that have lost more people than they can explain, names become bridges. She was 78 the year Willa first remembered her clearly. With white hair pinned so tightly it lifted the skin at her temples and spectacles that made her eyes look enlarged and watery. Miriam had been a Scrimshaw engraver when there was no clean way to say such a thing anymore. She did not hunt. She did not praise the old trade without sorrow. What she kept was the hand skill, the memory of line and patience, the knowledge of how a picture could be coaxed into a hard, pale surface without forgiving the harm that history had done to make that surface common. Her apartment smelled of beeswax, black tea, cold iron and orange peel drying on a plate. Against one wall stood a glass front cabinet filled with legal bone, antler, old piano key scraps, and small pieces of fossil ivory acquired before laws changed and the world tried, late but sincerely, to stop its appetite. Miriam spoke of materials with reverence, never hunger. "Use what is already here," she told Willa. "Never make the world poorer just to make a pretty thing." Their weekend ritual began at 9. Jonah would carry up coffee in a paper cup for Miriam and a twist donut for Willa from the bakery on Acushnet Avenue. Miriam would inspect Willa's hands first, not for cleanliness but for hurry. A person could wash off dirt. Hurry lived deeper. Then they would sit at the square table by the east window. Miriam kept a magnifying lens clamped to the table edge and a little tin box of sharpened steel points wrapped in wool. She taught Willa to polish with pumice in even circles, never rushing the surface, because every scratch left by impatience would take ink later and betray the hand. She taught her to brace her wrist with the heel of the palm, to breathe out before beginning a curve, to let the needle travel instead of stabbing at the line. The work was not drawing, Miriam said it was listening. On winter Saturdays, steam gathered on the window and the harbour became a grey thought beyond the roofs. Willa worked under the lens until her neck ached. Miriam would let the ache teach her. At noon, Jonah warmed soup on the little stove, and the three of them ate from mismatched bowls while Miriam told stories about men who carved whales they regretted killing, ships they missed, wives whose faces they could no longer remember exactly. Some of the pieces were crude, some were tender enough to trouble a person. Willa learned that an object could carry both beauty and debt. She learned that heritage was not always clean. She learned that the hand must become honest where history was not. Miriam's unforgettable sentence came on a wet Saturday in March when Willa ruined a piece by trying to darken the same line 3 times. The needle slipped, the curve broke. Willa put the tool down and looked at the table, burning with the private shame of a child who wanted badly to be worthy. Miriam took the piece, turned it once and gave it back. Nothing honest is ruined just because it shows where the hand trembled. She said it so plainly that Willa almost missed the mercy inside it. The meaning arrived later in pieces. A mistake could become part of the record. A tremor could tell the truth. A life did not need to appear untouched in order to be kept. Miriam died when Willa was 16, on a morning of sleet and weak light, after 3 days in the hospital in Fall River. Jonah came home carrying her spectacles in his coat pocket and did not remove his shoes for 20 minutes. Willa remembered that most clearly. He stood inside the door with salt melting off his soles, one hand braced against the wall, as though the house had shifted under him. After the funeral, the apartment was emptied by a cousin who had not visited in years. The cabinet went first, then the tools, then the boxes marked with Miriam's tidy hand. Jonah made phone calls, he drove to 2 houses and came back with nothing but a chipped teacup and 1 folder of receipts. No one had meant harm, people said. They had not known what mattered. That was how heritage vanished, Willa learned. Not always by fire, sometimes by tidying. Jonah kept the chipped teacup on his work table and used it for dull needles. He worked more slowly after that. He still taught Willa, but there were evenings when he looked at the empty place where Miriam's cabinet should have been, and his fingers stayed still too long. The old Scrimshaw pieces he had borrowed for study were gone. Her annotated notebooks were gone. A roll of family patterns drawn on linen tracing paper gone. Even the little bone-handled burnisher she had promised Willa one day had disappeared into somebody's estate box and then into silence. In the year after Miriam died, Elise married a man named Warren Pike. He was not loud. Loudness would have been easier to name. Warren wore pressed shirts, kept his shoes polished, and corrected the angle of picture frames with 2 fingers. He worked for a marine insurance office and spoke in the careful tone of a man used to forms. He never struck a wall, never cursed in front of company, never gave the neighbours a story they could carry away. But the house changed around him. The radio stopped playing in the mornings. Jonah's tools, which had once rested on the dining table during long commissions, were moved to a plastic bin in the pantry. Willa's chair by the back window became Warren's place for reading the paper. He disliked the smell of ink, disliked bone dust, disliked the old stories of wailing men and women who waited ashore with lamps in their windows. He said the past made people sentimental. He said sentiment made people poor. Jonah did not argue. By then his heart had begun to fail in ways he hid under jokes and long sleeves. He coughed after climbing stairs. He sat down before answering the telephone. His hands, once steady as plumb lines, trembled if he worked too close to midnight. Willa noticed. Warren noticed too, but in a different manner, as if weakness were a household expense that needed managing. When Jonah could no longer work at the harbour repair counter, Warren began using words like realistic and contribution. Elise folded towels in the next room. Willa took shifts washing dishes at a breakfast place near County Street and came home smelling of fryer oil, her tips tucked into her sock. She still worked beside her father when he had the strength. She read aloud from old maritime histories, not because either of them needed the facts, but because the words made a harbour between them. Jonah died in late October, 3 days after rain flooded the gutters and brought yellow leaves against the curb in wet layers. The hospital returned his wedding ring, his wallet, and the engraving knife he had asked to hold because he said the weight steadied him. Willa carried the knife home wrapped in a handkerchief. The funeral was modest. Warren shook hands at the church door. Elise stood beside him in a black dress with one sleeve slightly twisted at the seam. Willa remembered wanting to reach over and fix it, and not doing so. 3 days later, the eviction came at the dining table. There was a cardboard produce box by the chair where Jonah used to sit. Warren had set it there before she came in from the breakfast place. Inside were her clothes, folded without care, 2 library books, Miriam's chipped teacup wrapped in newspaper, and Jonah's engraving knife in its handkerchief. On top lay the hymn book where she kept the money she had been saving from tips. The house smelled of boiled coffee and lemon floor cleaner. A clock ticked above the stove. Elise stood by the sink with her hands resting in the dishwater, though there were no dishes left to wash. Warren did not sit down. This house needs contributors, not mourners anymore. 8 words, exact and cold. Willa looked first at the box, then at her mother. Elise's eyes had gone to the window over the sink, where a gull moved across the pale sky and vanished behind the neighbour's roof. One of her wet hands tightened around a spoon under the water. She said nothing. That silence did not break loudly, it settled. Willa took the hymn book, opened to the back, and found the folded bills still there. $11, no coins, no hidden mercy. She placed the money in the pocket of her work apron, tucked the knife inside her coat, and lifted the box. It was heavier than it should have been, because grief adds weight to cotton and paper. At the door, she waited without knowing what she was waiting for. Her mother wiped her hands on a towel. Willa stepped outside. The porch boards were damp, a maple leaf stuck to the toe of her shoe. Behind her, the door closed with the small, careful click of a person trying not to be overheard. For 6 weeks, Willa moved through Massachusetts as if she were a loose thread the state had not yet noticed. The first night she slept in the entryway of a closed beauty school near Purchase Street, sitting upright with the produce box between her knees and her coat pulled over her hands. The second night she found a pew at a church in Fairhaven after a supper volunteer, a woman with red knuckles and a silver cross, let her remain until morning without asking for the whole story. She learned the hours of public buildings. The New Bedford Free Public Library opened at 9 and held warmth in its stone longer than the street did. The bus terminal bathroom was checked every 40 minutes by a tired attendant who hummed gospel under her breath. A laundromat on Union Street stayed open until 11, and if Willa bought 1 small box of detergent for 75 cents, she could sit there with her clothes in the dryer and pretend she was waiting for something ordinary. Her money diminished in exact, humiliating measures. $1.50 for day-old rolls, 75 cents for detergent, $2 for a bus ride to Fall River when she heard of a dishwashing job that had already been filled, a quarter for a paper cup of coffee she made last 3 hours. She kept Jonah's knife wrapped and close. She sold nothing from the box, not the teacup, not the books, not the only sweater Miriam had once mended at the cuff. Some things were not useful in the way hunger understood. But Willa had begun to suspect that usefulness was not the only measure by which a life survived. In Fall River, she slept one night behind a Portuguese bakery where the vent breathed warm yeast into the alley until 2 in the morning. In Taunton, she slept under the covered bench at the bus station, waking each time headlights crossed the glass. In Providence, after walking farther than she meant to walk, she spent 4 nights in the reading room of the Central Library during the day, and in the corner of a shelter dormitory at night, where women coughed, muttered, prayed, and guarded their shoes with the instincts of soldiers. She did not call the house. There was no one there to call. At the shelter, an older woman named Ruth showed her how to fold her coat into a pillow without exposing the pockets. A janitor at the Providence Library, seeing Willa copy addresses from the classified section, told her which streets to avoid after dark. A bus driver outside Wareham let her ride 2 stops without fare when sleet began to come down sideways and her hands would not close around the box handle. Small kindnesses rarely announced themselves. They came wrapped in rough voices, paper napkins, a door held open without comment. By the 6th week, Willa had $1 left, Jonah's knife, Miriam's teacup, and the habit of entering libraries as if they were churches. She had circled job listings until the pencil broke. She had written her name on applications for diners, laundries, storage offices, a fish packing room, and a motel where the manager looked at her box and said the position had been taken though the sign remained in the window. On a Thursday afternoon in the New Bedford Library, rain laid itself against the tall windows and turned the reading room dim. Willa sat at a long oak table beneath a green lamp and opened a local weekly paper someone had left folded near the obituaries. She was not looking for property. A person with $1 does not look for property. She was looking for work that paid cash and did not require an address. The notice was at the bottom of a column between estate sales and municipal surplus. County disposal auction. Condemned structure, formerly Harbour Bone and Ivory Scrimshaw Studio, South Water Street Extension, New Bedford, Bristol County, parcel non-conforming, no utilities guaranteed, buyer assumes all risk, taxes, liens, removal, repair and code compliance, minimum bid $11, inspection by appointment only, demolition pending spring review. She read it once, then again. The words did not brighten, they did not become reasonable, they remained exactly what they were. Harbour Bone and Ivory, Scrimshaw Studio. Minimum bid $11. Her fingers went to the pocket where the last bill rested, soft from being unfolded and folded too many times. The amount was wrong. She had thought she had $1, but in the hymn book, pressed behind the back cover where grief had made her careless, there were still 2 $5 bills she had not found since the night she left. The discovery had come that morning when she shook the book open to flatten a bent page. $11. The same exact sum. A librarian passed behind her with a cart of returned books. Rain clicked against the glass somewhere. A radiator knocked once and then went still. Willa copied the notice by hand on the back of an envelope. She copied the address twice. She wrote the words "no utilities guaranteed" and "buyer assumes all risk" because those seemed like words a person should not ignore. Then she sat with the pencil in her hand until the lamp hummed above her and the room began to thin toward closing. She had no reason to believe the building could save her. That was not what made her rise. What made her rise was the name of the trade, printed in plain black ink where anyone might have passed it by. Scrimshaw. A word that carried Miriam's breath. Jonah's hands, the Saturday window, the magnifying lens, the bitter mercy of careful work. A word that had outlived the people who taught it to her and had now appeared at the bottom of a county notice, like a candle left in an abandoned room. At closing time, Willa returned the newspaper to the table and placed the envelope in her pocket. She walked to the bus terminal in a rain that had become a mist, carrying the produce box against her hip. The city smelled of wet brick, diesel, and harbour mud. She bought no supper. She kept the $11 whole. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would go to the county clerk's office and ask how a condemned building could be bought by someone who owned nothing else. She would stand there with her box, her father's knife, and the exact amount written in the notice. She would not pretend she knew more than she did. She would not ask the past to be kind. She would only follow the word that had found her. And before that day ended, Willa would be walking toward a boarded-up studio at the edge of the old harbour, where the rain had been entering for years and a locked drawer still waited under a workbench no one had touched. The first bus left before the harbour had taken colour. She climbed aboard with the cardboard box on her lap and the hymn book pressed flat against one side, so the driver would not see how little she had managed to carry from one life into the next. The heater under the seat gave off a dry metallic breath that smelled faintly of dust and pennies. Outside, New Bedford passed in broken pieces through the wet window, bakery lights, dark porches, gulls standing on chimneys, a man unlocking the front door of a pawn shop with his collar turned up. She did not sleep. The road would not let her. The bus carried her north first because public routes are not drawn according to sorrow or need. It took her through a cushnet under a sky the colour of dishwater, then toward the county offices by way of a transfer that required her to wait 47 minutes beside a vending machine that sold crackers, gum, and one kind of aspirin. Her shoes were thin at the soles. She kept lifting one foot, then the other, not from impatience but because the cold had entered the concrete and was coming up through her bones. By late morning the rain had stopped and the wind had sharpened. The county building stood near a narrow street, lined with sycamores that had already dropped most of their leaves. Its stone steps were worn hollow in the middle by generations of boots, church shoes, legal errands, tax worries, marriage hopes, and all the other reasons people brought their names before a counter. Willa stood at the bottom step for a time, looking up at the brass doors. There were places that seemed designed to remind a person that they had arrived too late. She climbed anyway. Inside, the air was overheated and smelled of floor wax, damp wool, copier toner and paper that had been stored for decades in cabinets. A security guard in a brown sweater looked at her box, then at her face, and pointed with 2 fingers toward a hallway. He did not ask what she was doing there. That was its own kind of mercy. The clerk's office was at the end, under a frosted glass panel lettered in black, County Property Disposal and Recording. Below it, someone had taped a sheet of paper announcing changed winter hours. A rubber plant leaned toward the window. Beside the door stood 3 wooden chairs with cane seats, one split and tied underneath with twine. She took the chair nearest the wall. From behind the counter came the dull percussion of a stamp, the turning of paper, the slide of a drawer, the cough of an older man somewhere out of sight. The room had no music. It had the kind of silence that expects people to wait. A woman with a silver bun and a blue cardigan came to the counter holding a manila folder against her chest. Her eyeglasses hung from a beaded chain, and the lenses had the faint permanent fog of a person who cleaned them with whatever cloth was nearest. On the desk before her was a black nameplate with white letters. M.R.'s Evelyn Pritchard. County Clerk. She studied Willa without being unkind. "May I help you?" Willa rose too fast, and the box shifted against her hip. She set it down beside her feet. The sound of cardboard touching tile seemed louder than it should have been. "I came about the disposal auction." Mrs. Pritchard looked past her, as if expecting a parent, a buyer, a contractor, anyone with a folder and a coat that buttoned properly. Seeing no one, she lowered her eyes to Willa's hands. "Which parcel?" Willa unfolded the envelope and smoothed it on the counter. The pencil marks had blurred slightly from rain. She pointed to the line she had copied. The clerk read it. Her mouth changed, not enough to become an expression, only enough to show that the place had weight in her memory. She opened the manila folder she had been carrying, then turned to a cabinet behind her and pulled out another file bound with a red string. "You came for this one," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You understand it is condemned?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there are no utilities guaranteed?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the roof leaks?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county is not promising that it can be made habitable?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand that once the deed is recorded, the liability is yours?" Willa's hands rested on the counter. Her fingernails were clean because libraries had bathrooms and soap, but the skin around them was chapped from cold and dishwater. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Pritchard looked at her for a longer moment, then there was no impatience in it, only an old public office caution, the careful habit of a woman who had seen desperate people sign papers that followed them for years. "You also understand," she said more softly, "that buying a building is not the same thing as having a home." Willa kept her eyes on the form. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk did not answer immediately. She removed the string from the file and opened it flat. Inside were survey sheets, tax notices, 2 photographs taken from the street, a condemnation order, and a map where the property had been outlined in yellow. The map looked older than the photocopy around it. Its lines were precise, but the place itself seemed to have slipped out from under them. There was no competitive bid, Mrs. Pritchard said. No one else submitted interest. The minimum was set to clear the parcel before demolition review. She lifted a receipt book from under the counter. Payment must be exact. Willa reached into her pocket and placed the folded bills on the counter. She did not flatten them all at once. She opened them carefully, as if they were thin leaves from an old book, and laid them beneath the clerk's hand. Mrs. Pritchard counted them without comment. The receipt book had carbon paper between its pages. The clerk wrote the parcel number, the date, and the name from the form. Willa filled in with a borrowed black pen. Willa made each letter slowly. Her hand was steady until she came to the signature line. There she paused, not because she was unsure of the name, but because a signature was the one possession no one could pack into a box for her. She signed. The clerk turned to a brass stamp mounted on a worn wooden base. Its handle had been polished dark by decades of palms. When she pressed it down, the sound travelled through the counter and into the floor. Recorded. Another page, another stamp. Accepted. A third page, folded and sealed. Transfer. Mrs. Pritchard slid the packet toward her, along with a county envelope and a single key attached to a paper tag by a loop of brown string. The front padlock is county issued. This key should open it if the lock hasn't rusted through. If it fails, you will need bolt cutters, and you will need to keep the broken lock as evidence for the file. Yes, ma'am. Do not light a fire until the chimney has been inspected. Yes, ma'am. Do not sleep under the north roof line. Yes, ma'am. Do not drink from any tap unless water service is confirmed. Yes, ma'am. And do not, under any circumstance, assume a floor is sound because it looks sound. Willa nodded. Mrs. Pritchard opened a drawer and took out an old municipal map, not the polished kind given to visitors, but a folded sheet with handwritten corrections in blue ink. She marked the route with a pencil, then turned it around so Willa could see. From here you take the bus back toward the harbour, but it won't leave you close. Get off near County Street. Walk east until you reach Union, then down toward the water. South Water Street breaks, continues and narrows. You will pass a marine supply warehouse, a closed sail loft, and an iron fence around a lot that used to be a cooperage. Keep going even when it looks like the road has ended. It has not. The parcel is beyond the old rope-walk foundation. The clerk stopped, one finger resting on the map. Then she looked again at the signature. That surname, she said. Willa stood very still. Mrs. Pritchard adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the form, as if the letters might rearrange themselves if she only looked hard enough. There used to be an engraver with that name. Not your father before him. A woman. She lived over near Johnny Cake Hill. The room seemed to quiet around Willa, though nothing in it had changed. The copier still murmured. A drawer opened in the back. Someone laughed once in the hallway and then lowered his voice. Mrs. Pritchard touched the corner of the paper. My mother had a little mourning brooch repaired by her. Black glass, gold rim. She said the woman worked with a magnifier and never wasted a line. The brooch had been my grandmother's after the repair. You could hardly see where it had cracked. Willa could feel the wrapped knife inside her coat. It rested against her ribs, colder than her skin. She was family, she said. The clerk received this answer without asking for the story that lay beneath it. Her face softened only at the edges. I thought there might be a connection. Willa looked down at the key on its brown string. Mrs. Pritchard reached beneath the counter and took out a small envelope, the kind used for petty cash, from it. She removed one folded bill and placed it in the drawer of her desk instead of the cash box. This one I will hold until the receipt is reconciled at closing, she said, though there was no reason to explain such a thing. Sometimes money comes through here, and it is gone before anybody has properly understood what it meant. Willa did not know what to say. "Thank you," she managed. The clerk lifted the county envelope and tapped it once on the counter to settle the papers inside. "If anyone asks, you own it now. That does not make it safe, it makes it yours to answer for." Willa placed the envelope in the box beside the chipped teacup and the hymn book. The key she put around her wrist by its string, looping it twice so it would not fall. Outside, the wind had cleared the clouds into a high, hard blue. She rode the bus back toward New Bedford with the box under one arm and the map folded in her pocket. At each stop, ordinary people boarded and left. A woman with 2 grocery bags, a man in paint-spattered pants, 3 students with headphones, an older couple who smelled faintly of peppermint and rain. None of them knew that a condemned structure had just changed hands for less than the price of a restaurant meal. The bus left her near County Street, as the clerk had said. The afternoon was already leaning toward evening. She walked east. New Bedford did not present itself all at once. It arrived in layers. The inland streets with triple-deckers and laundry lines, the old brick commercial blocks with faded painted advertisements, the sudden glint of water between buildings, the sharp clean bite of salt beneath the heavier smells of diesel, kelp, wet rope, and fish packed somewhere out of sight. She passed 5 businesses still lit against the cold, a Portuguese bakery with sweet bread cooling in the front window, a marine supply shop with orange buoys stacked like pumpkins, a barber shop where an elderly man swept hair into a careful pile, a diner with blue vinyl stools and steam on the glass, and a pawn shop whose display held watches, fishing reels, and a tarnished trumpet with one valve missing. At the corner, a woman came out of the bakery carrying 2 paper bags. Warmth followed her through the door. Willa looked away before hunger could make her foolish. She crossed Union Street and continued down toward the waterfront. The sidewalks became uneven. Cobbles appeared in patches where asphalt had thinned. A gull tore at something silver near a storm drain. Wind moved loose paper along the curb in fits and starts. South Water Street did not so much continue as remember itself. It narrowed after the newer buildings fell away, running between old warehouses that had been cut up into storage bays, offices and empty windows. Some still carried names in faded lettering high on the brick: Hathaway Marine, Briggs Canvas, Atlantic Cordage. Others had no names left, only outlines where signs had been removed. A man in a watch cap stood smoking by a loading dock. He watched her pass and looked at the box, then at the map in her hand. "Lost." "No, sir." He nodded toward the water. "Road gets broken up down there." "Yes, sir." A black dog behind a chain-link fence barked twice, then grew bored and lowered its head to its paws. Beyond the fence was a yard of rusted anchors, stacked lobster traps, and one green skiff turned upside down on blocks. The skiff had collected rainwater along its keel. A thin skin of ice trembled there when the wind touched it. She kept going. At the closed sail loft, long boards covered the lower windows, but the upper panes held the sky in dusty squares. A pulley still hung above the loft door. Its rope had frayed to a few pale strands. Beside the building, weeds grew through a cracked run of concrete where wagons or trucks had once backed in. They were winter weeds now, stiff and colourless, but they leaned all in the same direction, bent by harbour wind. Past the iron fence around the old cooperage lot, the city grew suddenly spare. The street became a rough strip of gravel and tar. On one side, marsh grass moved in tawny waves beyond a low place where water gathered. On the other, a row of walnut trees stood at the edge of a vacant parcel, their branches black and patient against the sky. The clerk had mentioned them only as a landmark, but to Willa they looked like witnesses. She stopped under the first tree and unfolded the map. The property line began there. For a moment she could see nothing that matched the word studio. There was only brush, weathered fencing, a leaning signboard, and behind it a low building set back from the road, as if it had tried year after year to become part of the ground. Then her eyes adjusted. The building was smaller than she expected, and more stubborn. It stood on a fieldstone foundation, 22 feet wide at the front and perhaps 36 feet deep, with cedar shingles gone silver and black in patches from weather. The roof pitched steeply, old slate on the south side and temporary tar patches on the north, where 2 sheets of corrugated metal had been nailed down and then left to rust. A brick chimney rose from the rear half, leaning a little but not surrendered. The front door was made of vertical planks, cross-braced and scarred. A county padlock hung through a hasp bright enough to look recent above the door. Under a shallow wooden hood, a sign remained, though half the paint had peeled away. Harbour Bone and Ivory. Scrimshaw and Repair. The letters had been done by hand, not quickly. Whoever painted them had known the value of spacing. The front window was boarded from inside, but along the edge of one board a finger of late light entered and cut across the dust. The sill below had sagged where rot darkened the grain. Near the foundation a drift of leaves had collected and begun to compost against the stone. Rainwater had carved a narrow channel from the north corner to the road. Willa stood with the box in both arms. The building did not look rescued. It looked aware. She walked around once before opening it, because her father had taught her that any repair begins outside. The east wall had lost shingles near the sill. The west side held better, protected perhaps by the line of walnuts. At the rear, a narrow door hung under an iron strap hinge, sealed by rust and swelling. Behind it, a patch of ground sloped toward marsh grass, and, beyond that, a glimmer of harbour water moving under low light. There was an outhouse half hidden in bittersweet vines, its roof broken inward. A hand pump stood near the rear corner, wrapped in burlap gone stiff with age. The handle would not move when she tried it. She did not force it. Back at the front door, she put the box down on the driest board of the step. Her fingers were clumsy with cold. The key resisted the lock at first, entering only halfway before stopping against grit. She breathed on it, wiped it with the hem of her apron and tried again. This time it slid in with a reluctant scrape. The lock opened. The sound was small. She lifted it free and held it in her palm for a moment before setting it on the step. Then she pulled the door. It did not move. She set her shoulder against it, not hard enough to break anything, only steady. Something inside scraped along the floor. The door opened 3 inches, then 5, then enough for the smell to reach her. Dust first, then cold wood, then old salt. Under that, something darker, mouse nest, mildew, iron, dried seaweed, paper shut too long in drawers, and a faint sweet wax smell that had survived all the years without permission. She stepped inside. The front room had been a shop once, even in abandonment. Its arrangement remained legible. To the left stood a glass display case with one pane cracked diagonally, and the shelves bare except for dust and a dead fly. Along the right wall were peg rails where tools or finished pieces might have hung. Behind the counter, pigeonholes held curled invoices, string tags, and 2 brown bottles with corks blackened at the top. The floor dipped slightly in the centre. Mrs. Pritchard's warning returned to her, so Willa tested each board with the toe of her shoe before shifting her weight. The boards complained, but they did not give. Light entered in narrow bands through cracks in the boards over the window. It showed the room in strips, not enough to comfort, enough to reveal. A roll of brown paper had collapsed near the counter. Mouse droppings peppered the lower shelf. In one corner, a wasp nest hung empty and grey, shaped like a small abandoned heart. She listened. Wind moved along the eaves. Somewhere behind the wall, a loose metal flashing ticked once, then again. The building did not creak like a place falling down. It creaked like a place clearing its throat. The back room lay through a narrow doorway with no door. Willa paused at the threshold. Here the air changed. The shop smell gave way to the scent of work that had been interrupted and never properly dismissed. Oil, teak, stone dust, old cloth, faint ink, a little mineral coldness from materials stored too long away from hands. The room was larger than the front and lower ceilinged, with one broad workbench running under the south window and another against the west wall. The main bench was teak, darkened by use, its surface scarred with fine cuts that crossed and curved and feathered like maps of rivers. Generations of hands had rested there. She could see it before touching it. The wood had been polished not by varnish but by labour. A magnifying arm still clamped to one corner, its lens cloudy but whole. Beside it sat a stone cup with dried residue at the bottom. Drawers ran under the bench, some shallow, some deep, each fitted with half-moon pools dark with oxidation. Chalk marks had been written above 2 of them and worn nearly away. Patterns. Points. Teeth. She did not open them. Not then. The roof leak had found the north corner, as the notice warned. A black stain spread down the plaster there and disappeared behind a stack of warped boards. Below it, an enamel basin had been placed to catch water, but it had long since overflowed, dried, filled again, and left a ring of brown sediment. On the sill lay the brittle bodies of beetles. Above, a strip of daylight showed where slate had shifted. Willa set the cardboard box on the back bench because it seemed less likely to be stepped through. She removed the county envelope, the hymn book, the teacup, and her father's wrapped knife. One by one she placed them in a row. The sight of them there changed the room. Not repaired it, not warmed it, only answered it. She went back to the front and closed the door as much as the swollen frame allowed. It left a gap near the floor, but the wind softened. There was no electricity, no water, no bed, no stove. She trusted. In the back room she found a broom with half its straw missing and swept a clear place near the interior wall, away from the north roof line. Dust rose in a grey veil and made her cough until her eyes watered. She worked until dusk took the corners. From the box, she removed the sweater Miriam had mended and folded it into a pillow. She took the handkerchief from around Jonah's knife, then thought better of it and wrapped the knife again. The tool belonged covered until she had earned the right to use it here. The chipped teacup she set beneath the bench where it could not fall. As evening settled, sounds outside became distinct. Water moved somewhere beyond the marsh grass with a slow sucking pull. A truck passed far off, then another. The dog barked once from the yard up the road. Gulls gave way to the smaller, sharper calls of birds she could not name. The building cooled around her, board by board. She had not eaten since the morning before. Hunger came in waves, then retreated into a dull central ache. Cold was steadier. It entered through the floor first, then the wrists, then the space between her shoulder blades. She put on every piece of clothing she owned and lay on her side with her knees drawn up, facing the workbench. The dark gathered. Not all at once. It filled the front room, then the doorway, then the upper shelves, then the drawers under the bench. The magnifying lens became a round shadow. The half-moon drawer pulls held the last light longest, each one a small curved glimmer before it vanished. Willa kept her eyes open until there was nothing left to see. She listened to the house. It made patient sounds, a tick in the wall, a settling beam, rain beginning again, light at first, then fuller, finding the bad roof with the practiced certainty of water. Somewhere into the basin, drops began their irregular count. One, then another. Then a silence long enough to hold a breath. She reached out in the dark and laid her hand against the leg of the teak bench. The wood was cold, solid, real. For the first time in weeks, no one could tell her to leave before morning. The house had been waiting, so had she. By the third morning, Willa knew which boards would answer her weight, and which ones should be crossed like thin ice. The front room had a long complaint near the display case, a drawn-out groan that began under the second board from the wall and travelled toward the counter. The back room was steadier, except for one plank near the north stain that gave a soft, hollow knock when touched. She marked that one with a scrap of string tied around an exposed nail, because pencil would disappear in dust and memory could not be trusted when a person was cold. She learned the house in patient pieces. The hand pump behind the studio did not work on the first day or the second. On the third, after she loosened the packed dirt around the base with a broken screwdriver and poured a little water down the pipe from a bottle she had filled at the library bathroom, the handle moved 1 inch, then another. It gave up only rust at first, then a cough of brown water, then nothing. She did not drink from it. She caught a cupful in a tin can she found by the back door and set it aside so the sediment could settle. By evening a faint clear line had appeared at the top, and that felt like news from a distant country. The outhouse was worse than she had hoped and better than she feared. Its roof had sagged inward, but the seat board remained sound after she scraped the old leaves away. The door had lost its latch, so she tied it closed with a strip torn from the bottom of her apron. There was no dignity in such arrangements. There was only the old order of need. Each day she walked to the public bathroom at the bus terminal when she had to, carrying her face there the way a person carries a cracked dish. Carefully and without explanation, she washed at the sink. She rubbed her fingers under cold water until they stopped looking like the hands of somebody who had been sleeping on floors. When no one was watching, she filled 2 bottles and wrapped them in newspaper so the cold would not bite her palms on the walk back. At night, the studio spoke more freely. Wood settled. Mice moved inside one wall with the dry sound of seeds poured into paper. Wind touched the roof and found every lifted slate. Rain tapped the enamel basin in the north corner, then stopped, then began again. She began to understand that buildings have habits. A broken place is not without order. It only keeps a different ledger. On the 4th day, she went to the hardware store with the county envelope tucked under her sweater and the remaining contents of her pocket counted twice. The store sat on a corner where 2 harbour streets met at an angle, a weathered brick building with a green awning faded nearly grey and a bell over the door that gave one precise ring when she entered. The sign read Barker and Son Hardware, though later she learned there had been no son in the business for 23 years. Inside, the air smelled of cut wood, kerosene, machine oil, burlap, brass, and the clean mineral dust of plaster. Bins of nails lined one wall by size. Glass jars held washers, cotter pins, hinges and screws, sorted with a care that made Willa want to stand still and look for a while. Coils of rope hung from iron hooks. A narrow aisle held stove-black lamp wicks, sash cord, putty knives and mousetraps. Near the counter, old paint cards had curled at the edges, their colours named for flowers, lakes and colonial rooms no one had seen in person. The man behind the counter was tall and thin, with a white beard trimmed square at the bottom and hands as large as cedar shingles. His left thumb had been shortened at the first joint. He wore a brown canvas apron with a pencil tucked behind one ear and a measuring tape clipped to the front pocket. His name was stitched above the pocket, not printed on a badge. Samuel Barker. He looked up from sharpening a plane iron on an oilstone. What are you trying to keep from falling down? Willa had not prepared an answer that honest. A roof corner, she said, maybe a floor, a chimney, before winter gets worse. Those are 3 different troubles. Yes, sir. He wiped the plane iron once on a rag and set it aside. Where? She named the street and the studio. Mr. Barker's face did not change quickly. Some men kept reactions in a back room and brought them out only after inspection. He leaned one elbow on the counter and looked toward the windows as if measuring distance. That place still standing? Yes, sir. Not by much. No, sir. You bought it? Yes, sir. With what army? Willa rested both hands on the counter so they would not disappear into her sleeves. No army. The corner of his mouth moved. Not amusement, not pity. Something drier and more useful. He came around the counter and pulled a ledger from a shelf under the register. Its cover was black cloth worn grey along the corners. He opened it with the care of a church Bible and turned past names written in different inks, some crossed out, some marked paid, some left without judgment. I don't extend credit to strangers, he said. I understand. I don't like watching buildings die either. She waited. He tapped the pencil against the ledger. Small account, $10 limit to start, supplies only, no fancy wants. You come in Fridays and tell me what you used, what you ruined, and what still leaks. If you lie, the account closes. If you guess, say you're guessing. Willa swallowed once. Yes, sir. And you'll read before you hammer. Yes, sir. He reached beneath the counter and brought out a thick paperback with a cracked spine and a cover showing a man in a plaid shirt smiling beside a window frame. The title, in block letters, was Home Repair for Owner Occupants. Someone had written 1969 in blue pen across the inside page. This is outdated in places, he said, but wood still splits the same way. Water still travels downhill and mortar still fails where fools use the wrong mix. Bring it back when your hands know more than the book. Willa touched the cover with 2 fingers. I can pay you something for it. No, you can return it, not ruined. He began making a list before she could answer. He asked questions in a manner that did not leave room for shame. How large was the roof stain? What kind of basin caught the drip? Did the chimney smell of wet ash or dead animal? Were the bricks spalling or simply loose? Did the floor bounce or sink? Did the windows rattle? Had she seen daylight under the sill? She answered what she knew and said when she did not. The first supplies came to $9.63 against the account, and Mr. Barker wrote each item in the ledger with exact prices. One used claw hammer, head tight, handle scarred, $125. A £1 box of 8-penny common nails, $0.42. 2 ounces of roofing tacks folded in brown paper, $0.18 tons. A roll of tar paper remnants, 11 inches wide, tied with twine, 0.90 cents. 3 small cotton rags from the rag barrel, $0.10. A putty knife with a chipped corner, $0.35. 1 wire chimney brush, second-hand bristles bent but usable, $1.75. 20 feet of light rope, 0.68 cents. 1 tin of stove black, half full, 0.40 A packet of pumice paper. Assorted grit, 0.600. 2 candles and a box of matches, $0.55. 1 tin cup, dented, to 20 cents. A pound of rolled oats from the grocery shelf near the back, because he said repairs went worse on an empty stomach, $0.75. He wrapped the smaller things in newspaper and tied the bundle with string. The chimney brush was too awkward for the box, so he showed her how to sling it over her shoulder with the rope. It made her look, she suspected, like someone going to clean a church steeple with nothing but stubbornness. As she turned to leave, Mr. Barker called after her. "Girl." She stopped. "When you clean that flue, you do it from the bottom first. Don't go climbing a condemned roof to prove you're brave. Brave breaks its neck the same as foolish." "Yes, sir." "And wear something over your mouth." "Yes, sir." The bell rang once behind her. Back at the studio, she set the supplies in rows on the workbench and began with the chimney because heat was not comfort then. Heat was survival. The stove in the back room was small, cast iron, set on a cracked square of slate. Its pipe rose into the chimney through a thimble in the plaster. The stove door opened after she worked the latch loose with the putty knife. Inside lay a shallow bed of ash compacted by years of damp, a bird bone, 2 acorn caps, and a curled scrap of paper blackened at one edge. She carried the ash outside in the enamel basin and dumped it far from the building, as the old repair book advised. Then she tied one end of the rope to the handle of the chimney brush and fed it up through the stovepipe after disconnecting the lower joint. Soot fell immediately, soft and black, coating her wrists. She wrapped a rag over her nose and mouth, but it did little. The smell of creosote was sharp and bitter, like burnt tar and dead smoke. The work took 6 hours the first day and 2 more the next morning. She pushed the brush upward in short, controlled strokes, then drew it down slowly so it would not bind. Up 6 inches, turn, down 3, up again. The pipe gave off dry scraping sounds. Chunks of creosote broke loose and struck the metal below with the hard ticking of small stones. Twice the brush jammed where the flue narrowed, and she had to sit back on her heels, arms shaking, and work it free by loosening the rope 1 careful inch at a time. When the lower flue stopped dropping heavy flakes, she removed the pipe section and cleaned it separately outside, scraping the inner wall with the putty knife until the metal rang clearer under her knuckles. Her face became grey-black, except where sweat made pale tracks near her temples. Her hair smelled of soot. The rag at her mouth turned stiff. She did not climb the roof. She opened the clean-out door near the chimney base, a little iron square half hidden behind a stack of boards, and removed what time had left there: soot, dead insects, brittle straw, 2 walnut shells, and a compact nest made from paper, hair, and string. She was patient because Mr. Barker had warned her. A blocked chimney did not forgive haste. Smoke followed laziness back into the room. At 4 in the afternoon on the 5th day, She held a candle near the stove opening and watched the flame lean inward. Draft. The word felt nearly holy. She did not build a real fire at once. She made one small enough to be called a test, a twist of newspaper, 3 dry splinters from a broken crate, and 1 finger-thick piece of pine she had found under the counter in the front room. The flame took slowly, uncertain at first, blue at the paper edge, then orange along the wood. Smoke curled, hesitated, and moved up. She crouched before the stove with both hands extended. The room did not become warm. Not truly, but the stove began to remember its purpose. For supper she boiled water in the dented tin cup and stirred in oats until they thickened. She added nothing, no salt, no sugar, no milk. The meal was plain enough to show its own kindness. Steam touched her face. She ate slowly, scraping the cup clean with the edge of a wooden shim, and afterward she sat on the floor with her back against the bench while the stove clicked and settled. That night, for the first time, she slept in warmth that did not belong to a public room. The next morning she began the inventory of the workroom. She had avoided the drawers until then because opening them felt less like cleaning and more like speaking first in a place that had not yet agreed to know her. But repair requires knowledge, and knowledge begins by looking. She cleared a space on the bench, set the chipped teacup at the corner, and tore brown paper into labels with the pencil from the county office. She wrote what she found. Top right drawer, steel points 9, wrapped in rotted wool, 4 usable after cleaning, 1 bent, 3 rusted beyond repair, 1 missing its handle. Second right, cotton cloths stiff with age, a broken loop, 2 corked bottles, 1 empty, 1 holding dried black ink like a hardened night at the bottom. Third right, scraps of sandpaper, pumice stones worn to thumb shape, a leather strop cracked but still whole along one side. Top middle, tracing paper curled into tubes, most blank, some marked with faint outlines of ships, gulls, rope knots, laurel borders, and 1 woman's profile facing left. Second middle, brass calipers, a small ruler marked in 16ths, a carpenter's pencil, a tin of powdered graphite. Left upper drawer, invoice tags tied with string, yellowed, each one bearing a name, a date, or the ghost of both. Repairs, memorial pieces, knife scales, brooch settings, watchbacks. Left second drawer, handles without blades, blades without handles, 3 awls, a wooden mallet no longer than her palm, a small whetstone dark from use. She moved slowly. She did not keep everything simply because it was old. Mouse-chewed paper went into a burn pile. Rusted scraps she set aside. Anything that might teach went onto the bench in rows. By noon, the room had become less abandoned and more accountable. The lower left drawer resisted. It was deeper than the others and heavier before she opened it. The half-moon pull came away black on her fingers. She eased the drawer forward 2 inches, then stopped when something inside shifted with a dull, solid knock. Not the dry chatter of tools, not paper, something with weight. The chalk mark above it, nearly worn away, red teeth. She sat back on her heels. For a while she did not move. The laws around whale ivory had been explained to her by her father in language careful enough for a child and exact enough for an adult. Old material could be possessed under certain conditions, transferred under others, and sometimes not at all. Scrimshaw history lived in a narrow passage between preservation and harm. She knew enough to know she did not know enough. But the drawer was part of the building now. Inventory was not use. Looking was not selling. Looking was necessary. She pulled it farther. Inside lay a shallow bed of cotton batting turned brown at the edges. On top of it were rough, pale forms wrapped in cloth and tagged with numbers, not many, 6, perhaps 7, raw whale teeth or old stock meant for study, each one aged to a muted cream. Some bore cracks. One had a darkened root end. They had not been polished, they had been kept, not displayed. She did not unwrap them fully. She touched one through the cloth and felt the dense cold curve beneath. Then she noticed something that did not belong to the first order of the drawer. The interior depth looked wrong. The outside of the drawer, measured against the side panel, promised more room than the inside provided. The base seemed 2 inches too high. Willa leaned closer. Her father had taught her sound tests on knife handles and hollow boxes. Miriam had taught her weight tests on old cases that held secret repairs. Tap the known wood first, then the unknown. Let the ear compare before the mind explains. She removed the wrapped teeth one by one and placed them in a row on the bench, each on its own cloth. Then she tapped the drawer bottom with the handle of the putty knife. At the front, the sound was dull. At the back, dull again. Near the left corner, a slight change. Not hollow exactly, waiting. She tapped the side wall. Solid. She tapped the bottom again, moving in a grid no wider than her thumb. The sound shifted along a narrow line about 2 inches from the back. She felt under the lip and found no obvious latch. Dust filled the corners. A spider, pale and slow, moved away from the light. She lifted the drawer out entirely and set it on the floor. The underside showed old pine boards darkened by age, nailed in place with tiny cut nails. Nothing loose, nothing marked, but at the back left, embedded in a knot of darker wood, was a round cedar disc no larger than a coat button. It had been stained to match the bottom and nearly hidden by grime. Willa cleaned it with a cotton rag and breathed once through her mouth. The disc turned under pressure. Only a 1/4 inch, then stopped. She remembered Miriam's hands turning a bone button on a sample case, not a latch, a reluctance, a thing built to yield only to a person patient enough not to force it. Willa pressed inward, turned again, then slid the putty knife gently along the false seam inside the drawer. The bottom lifted at one corner with a dry whisper. She did not open it quickly. She sat there on the floor with one hand resting on the raised edge, listening to the stove, the wind, the small building around her. Discovery has its own danger. A person can reach too fast and break what time has guarded. So she worked the false bottom loose by degrees. The wood had swollen slightly over the years. She eased the putty knife along the seam, stopped when it resisted, shifted, tried again. A narrow flake came away at the front corner, and she set it aside like a tooth from a living mouth. After nearly 20 minutes, the false bottom released. Beneath it lay oilcloth. Not one package, but several, fitted into the hidden space with deliberate care. The top layer was wrapped in darkened sailcloth and tied with cotton cord. Under that were 2 flat parcels in brown waxed paper, a narrow wooden case and a small tin box whose lid had been sealed around the edge with wax gone brittle and white. Her hands grew cold despite the stove. She lifted the first package onto the bench and untied the cord. Inside were tools, finer than any she had seen in Miriam's apartment. Steel points fitted into turned handles of dark wood, a burin with a bone ferrule, a tiny scraper curved like a thumbnail, a burnisher wrapped in chamois, its handle worn smooth at the place where fingers had held it for years. Each tool had been oiled before storage. Time had browned the oil, but rust had not taken them. The second package held raw material, but not loose and not careless. Thin polished plates, each separated by cloth. Some were bone, some she could not immediately identify. All were aged, legal perhaps, perhaps not, and therefore not to be moved beyond the room until someone wiser advised her. She placed them in a row and wrote on a paper label, "Do not use, confirm." The flat parcels came next. The first held a completed panel wrapped in tissue. Its surface, the mellow ivory colour that age, gives only when it is not hurried. Willa did not breathe for several seconds after she uncovered it. The engraving showed a ship under full sail, entering a harbour lined with low roofs and church spires. In the background, smaller vessels lay at anchor. Smoke rose from chimneys on shore. Beneath the image, in script so fine it required the lens, were the words New Bedford 1847. The line work was exact beyond prettiness. Each mast had its rigging. Each window along the waterfront had been cut with a steady point. The harbour was not imagined. It had been seen. She uncovered the second, then the third, then all 6. 6 completed ivory panels. 6 views from the same vanished year, perhaps the same season, perhaps the same hand, a wharf crowded with barrels, a cooper bent over his work, a whaling ship being fitted out, women standing at a rail while a vessel departed, a storm line beyond the harbour mouth. A night scene with lamps in windows and one tiny figure holding a lantern near a door. Willa set them on the bench and then stepped back. Museum pieces. The phrase came not from greed but from warning. These were not trinkets to be owned in the ordinary way. They were witnesses from a trade that had fed families and emptied oceans, carried grief across water, and left behind objects too complicated to praise simply. They belonged to history first. Whoever had hidden them had known that. The wooden case held documents too brittle to unfold fully in the dim light, so she stopped after lifting one corner and seeing a neat column of names, dates, and weights. The tin box remained. It was rectangular, no longer than her hand, painted black once, now scratched to dull metal at the edges. The wax seal cracked when she touched it. She did not open it with the knife. Jonah's knife was not for prying. She used the putty knife instead and worked under the lid until it gave. Inside lay money. Not loose, not careless. Bundled. Bills wrapped in paper bands browned by age, coins in small cloth sacks tied with thread, a folded envelope, a medal wrapped in blue cloth, a narrow packet of newspaper clippings, a letter sealed but unaddressed. She closed the lid halfway, then opened it again because not knowing would not make the contents disappear. The counting took the rest of the afternoon and part of the evening, because she did it on the cleared bench with the lamp of late day moving across the room and no electricity to help. When the light failed, she counted once, wrote each amount, then counted again. She did not trust the first sum. She did not trust the second until it matched. There were older bills, many no longer crisp but still whole, tucked in denominations that spoke of careful accumulation rather than one dramatic hiding, tens, 20s, 50s, a few hundreds. Later date notes added by some hand after the first cash, suggesting the compartment had been used across years, maybe decades. Then sealed finally by the last person who knew. There were coins too. Liberty Head nickels, Barber dimes, Mercury dimes, standing Liberty quarters worn nearly flat, walking Liberty $half, Indian head cents, wheat pennies, 2 Morgan silver dollars, $1 dollar, and a small roll of half eagles that she did not remove from their paper once she saw the first gold edge. The total came to $47,800. Not more, not less. No cents, no modern oddity, just a sum so large in that room that the stove seemed to grow quieter beside it. She wrote the number on the back of an invoice tag and stared at it until the figures stopped, meaning money, and became marks of pressure from her pencil. $47,800. The medal, when she unwrapped it, lay heavy in her palm. A military medal with a faded ribbon, tarnished at the raised edges, dated 1918 on the back. The name had been engraved in small capitals, but the light was poor and she would not risk misreading it. She wrapped it again and set it beside the letter. The letter mattered. She knew that before opening it. It had been folded square and sealed with wax, not red now but dark brown, impressed with a mark she could not make out, no address, no name on the outside, only 4 words written in careful ink. For the next hand, Willa sat with the letter before her while darkness closed the windows. She did not read it that night. There are discoveries the mind cannot receive until the body has first admitted that the world is still there. She placed the money back in the tin, not perfectly as before, but with reverence enough. She rewrapped the panels one by one, each with clean cloth between the surface and her fingers. She set the tools together. She placed the medal beside the sealed letter and lowered everything except the panels back into the hidden space. The panels she kept on the bench beneath a cotton cloth, weighted at the corners so no draught could touch them. Then she carried the tin box to the front room, stopped, and carried it back. Fear had no proper instruction, neither did trust. Finally, she took only the letter and the medal, wrapped them in Jonah's handkerchief and placed them under the sweater she used as a pillow. She closed the drawer without resetting the false bottom because pretending the compartment had not opened seemed disrespectful now. Outside night had come clear and cold. Willa opened the back door with care and stepped onto the ground behind the studio. The marsh grass had gone silver under moonlight, Water moved in the distance beyond the lowland, not bright exactly, but alive with a pale shifting line. The walnut trees stood between the house and the road, black against a sky salted with stars. She walked to the edge of the marsh and stood there until her breath slowed. No one knew what had happened. The county clerk did not know. Mr. Barker did not know. The people on the bus, the woman at the bakery, the man with the cigarette by the loading dock, the dog behind the fence, none of them knew that the bottom of a drawer had opened and returned a century of silence into her hands. The cold entered her shoes. She let it. Across the water, a buoy bell sounded once, then not again. She thought of Miriam's magnifier, Jonah's hands, the objects lost after death because no one had known how to measure them. She thought of the 6 panels under cloth, exact and careful, showing a year the world had spent and could not make again. She thought of the money hidden with them, not as rescue yet, but as responsibility. There was danger in being saved too quickly. A person could mistake relief for permission. When she went back inside, she did not touch the letter. She lay down beside the workbench with the handkerchief bundle beneath her head and the stove gone low beside her. In the dark, the hidden drawer seemed less like a secret and more like a second heartbeat under the bench, slow and kept and deliberate. Rain began sometime after midnight, light at first, then steady. The drops found the basin in the north corner. The stove ticked as it cooled. Willa kept one hand on the floorboards and listened to the old studio breathe around what it had guarded. The house had been waiting, so had she. Morning came through the boarded window in narrow stripes. Willa woke before the harbour trucks began their work, with her cheek pressed against the folded sweater and the handkerchief bundle still under her head. For a few seconds, she knew only the floor, the cold, and the ache along her shoulder where a board seam had marked her through the night. Then her hand found the cloth. She sat up slowly. The stove had gone out. Grey ash lay behind the grate, soft and spent. The basin in the north corner held another inch of rainwater, and one drop still fell every minute or so from the stained plaster above it, patient as a clock that did not care whether anyone was listening. She unwrapped the handkerchief on the workbench. The medal came first, dull in the weak light, then the envelope. For the next hand. She looked at those words longer than she needed to. The ink had browned at the edges, but had not failed. The hand was disciplined, slightly right-leaning, with a narrow loop on the H and a firm cross on the T. It was not Miriam's hand, it was not Jonah's. Yet something in its steadiness seemed kin to both, as if careful people, separated by years, still leaned over paper in the same manner. Willa lit one of Mr. Barker's candles and set it in the chipped teacup because the morning remained dim and because a letter hidden for that long deserved more than grey light. The flame made the old glaze shine along the crack. She broke the seal with her thumbnail, not the knife. The wax split cleanly. The paper opened along creases already made for her. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then either the house kept faith longer than I expected, or I placed my hope in a drawer and time had mercy upon it. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you are blood of my blood, apprentice of the hand, purchaser by law, wanderer by hunger, or simply the person patient enough to listen when a hidden board answered differently beneath the knuckle. Whoever you are, sit down before you read further. A standing body does not hear inheritance clearly. My name is Eliza Mercy Hart Bell, born in New Bedford in 1869, daughter of Nathaniel Hart of County Street and Abigail Spooner Bell of Fairhaven. I am writing from this workroom on the 23rd day of October 1921. 2 weeks ago, in Boston, at Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. Charles Whitcomb placed his spectacles on the edge of his desk and told me that the pain in my side was not gallstones, not weakness, not nerves, but cancer of the liver. He said months in the kind way doctors say weeks. I took the train home with my gloves folded in my lap, and the knowledge that I had less time than the drawers, so I am putting in order what my hands can still order. The work began before this house had its sign. My great-grandfather Elias Hart came to New Bedford from Nantucket in 1818 with a sea chest, a Bible, and a left hand missing 2 fingers from a rope accident near Cape Horn. He could no longer ship out, so he learned to carve stay busks, pie crimpers, knife handles, and small mementos from what the whaling voyages brought home in excess and ignorance. His wife, Mercy Coffin Hart, born 1802, kept the account book because Elias made numbers lean the wrong way. It was she who first marked patterns on paper and corrected his borders when his eyes grew poor. Their son, Josiah Hart, born 1829, apprenticed under a cooper on the waterfront and married Ruth Bell, whose people kept a little shop in Fairhaven. Josiah made tool handles by day and engraved at night. He signed nothing. He said the object belonged to the one who mourned or remembered, not to the hand that cut it. Their daughter, my mother Abigail, born 1847 in the same summer, one of the panels beneath this letter was made, had the cleanest line in the family. She married my father, Nathaniel, who had a patient hand but no gift for faces, and together they opened Harbour Bone and Ivory in this room in 1878. I was their only child who lived past 7 years old. My brothers Thomas and Eli died of scarlet fever in 1874, 3 days apart, and my mother never again allowed red cloth in the house. I learned the trade because there was no son left to learn it, and because my mother said grief should be given work, or it will eat the beams from inside a person. Here is the truth I ask you to hold carefully. The old trade is not innocent. It came from ships that hunted creatures grander than our need, and from a nation that mistook taking for courage. Do not let nostalgia polish the blood out of history. Still, the hands that worked in this room were not all cruel. Some were hungry, some were widowed. Some returned from sea broken in the mind and used a needlepoint to draw the home they feared they would forget. If there is guilt in the material, there is also testimony in the marks. Keep both. Do not choose the easier half. The event that closed us was the fire of January 14th, 1897, on the North Wharf, the night the old oil storehouse burned and took with it the last crates of legal, documented raw tooth stock my father had purchased before the market collapsed. Men said the fire began in a lamp room. Others said insurance. By dawn, the wharf pilings were smoking in black ice, and 3 shops near the water had lost everything. Ours did not burn, but the trade ended there, as surely as if flame had crossed this threshold. After that, there were fewer commissions, then repairs only, then memories pretending to be business. For more than 30 years, I kept the sign painted because I could not bear to take it down. Some weeks no one came through the front door except the postman and the Reverend. I repaired cracked brooches, sailors' canes, watchbacks, and one ivory miniature whose owner cried because the woman in it had been dead 46 years. I also said no more often than yes, no to new whale ivory, no to men who wanted trophies without sorrow, no to collectors who asked what old grief was worth by the inch. War took the rest of what I had. My husband, Samuel Bell, died in 1898 of fever after service in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, buried first in foreign heat, and later brought home in a coffin I was told not to open. My son, Nathaniel Samuel Bell, enlisted in 1917 and was killed in France near Belleau Wood in June of 1918, though the letter did not reach me until August. My younger brother, Peter Hart, who was too old for the trenches but not too old to drive supplies, died of influenza at Camp Devons that same autumn. The medal wrapped with this letter was Nathaniel's. If you're able, let it see daylight once in a while. A medal left in darkness too long becomes only metal. Now I will speak of the work because feeling without instruction leaves nothing useful behind. If you restore the old practice, do it lawfully and with reverence. Use only documented antique material already in human keeping, or lawful substitutes, bone, antler, tagua nut, piano key scrap, or fossil material whose origin you can prove. For polishing, begin with dry pumice no coarser than 400 grit. Work in circles no wider than a nickel. If the surface heats under your thumb, you are pressing too hard. Let the piece rest. Bone and ivory both remember heat. For final smoothing, use 600 and then 1200 grit, not because shine is holiness, but because ink tells every scratch. Wash with a cloth dampened in clean water and a drop of spirits, never soak. Dry overnight if the air is damp. When using lamp black, mix 1 part dry pigment with 3 parts gum arabic water, then add 1 drop of clove oil for each spoonful to slow cracking. India ink may be used if it has not thickened. Warm the bottle in water no hotter than 100 degrees, never over flame. Cut under magnification if your eyes require humility. A 10-power lens is enough for most borders. Brace the heel of your hand. Pull the line toward you when possible. Push only on short marks. Make the first incision shallow. Deep lines are earned by return, not force. After cutting rub ink across the work with cotton, press it into the channels and wait 9 minutes before wiping the surface clean. If you wipe too soon, the line will pale. If you wait too long, the ground will stain. Use linen for the first wiping and the heel of your palm for the final warmth. Never sharpen a point when angry. Never price a mourning piece while the mourner stands before you. Never hurry a ship's rigging, a woman's eye, a child's name, or the empty space around a lantern. Empty space is often where the dead are standing. The money in the tin is not a fortune, though perhaps it will look like one to someone in need. It was gathered from repairs, from my mother's careful savings, from Samuel's back pay, from the sale of land we could no longer keep, and from commissions paid by people who are themselves now dust. Use it slowly, roof first, chimney second, sills before paint, food before pride, law before desire. If you do not need all of it, do not spend all of it. Leave something for the next one, because we are never the last person in need, only the one currently holding the key. Inheritance is not ownership. I learned that late. For many years I believed this house was mine because my name was on papers and because my hands knew its drawers in the dark, but a house is older than the names written for it. A craft is longer than the hand that performs it. Money is brief. Tools are faithful only if cleaned. A secret becomes poison if hoarded, and a blessing if tended. If you have been cast out, know this: you are not less real because someone refused to make room for you. If you have bought this place for almost nothing, do not believe that nothing is what it is worth. The world often misprices what is patient. Behind the studio, under the second walnut tree, you will find a horseshoe grown into the bark at shoulder height. My father nailed it there the week the shop opened. Not for luck, he said, but to remind the house that iron also bends when heated enough. Beneath that tree is a flat stone marking my mother's first buried tool roll. Ruined by flood but too beloved to discard. Touch the stone when you doubt the work. It has listened before. The candle wrapped in the brown paper is from my mother's last beeswax batch, poured in 1861 while the country was breaking, and my grandmother prayed over every wick. Light it when you understand that you are not beginning alone. I have no certainty that anyone will read this. Certainty is a luxury often mistaken for faith. I have only the drawer, the hidden bottom, the cedar turn, and the belief that somewhere beyond my last morning there may be one careful person who needs shelter more than explanation. The house is not empty, it has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eliza Mercy Hart Bell. Harbour Bone and Ivory. October 23rd, 1921. Willa read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again. By the second reading, the candle had burned a small well around its wick, and the room had taken on the faint honeyed scent of warmed wax. She did not cry in any way that made sound. Tears came and cooled on her face, and she let them remain until they dried there. The letter lay open on the bench between her hands, its long sentences still breathing with the strength of someone who had chosen exactness over despair. She touched the signature last. Eliza Mercy Hart Bell. The name did not need to be repeated aloud. It had already entered the room. Willa folded the pages along their original creases, taking care not to make new ones. The paper knew how it wanted to close. She followed. Then she placed the folded letter back inside its envelope without sealing it and set it beside the medal. Outside, daylight had strengthened. She put on her sweater, wrapped the medal and letter in Jonah's handkerchief, and opened the back door. The cold met her honestly, without malice. Behind the studio, the ground held the damp shine of last night's rain. Marsh grass leaned under the wind. The hand pump stood rigid near the corner, its burlap wrapping moving faintly. The walnut trees waited along the property line. She counted from the studio side. The first tree had split bark near its base and a knot shaped like an eye. The second stood broader, with one limb reaching toward the building and another toward the road. At shoulder height, half swallowed by living wood, was the curve of an old horseshoe. Time had drawn bark over the ends until the iron seemed less nailed there than grown there by some dark patience of the tree, Rust showed only along the outer rim, lichen had gathered in the nail holes. Willa laid her fingers against it. The iron was cold and rough, but beneath that, the tree was alive. She knelt in the wet leaves and cleared around the base with both hands. At first there was only soil, roots, shell fragments, and the blackened remains of walnuts. Then her fingers struck stone. She brushed away more leaves and uncovered a flat marker, not a grave marker, not carved with a name, only a local fieldstone laid deliberately beneath the tree. Its surface held a shallow scratched line nearly gone, like the beginning of a border. My mother's first buried tool roll. Willa sat back on her heels. The lost things were not all lost in the same way. Some had been taken by cousins, some had been sold by people who did not know their names, some had been buried because love could not throw them away. She rested her palm on the stone until the cold worked through her skin. When she returned inside, she searched the hidden compartment again, this time looking beneath the cloth that had wrapped the wooden case. There, just as the letter had said, lay a long brown paper parcel tied with linen thread. She lifted it with a care that made her shoulders ache. The paper cracked slightly at one corner, releasing a scent unlike the dust of the room, beeswax, faint smoke, and a dry sweetness like summer stored past reason. Inside was a candle the colour of old cream, narrow and hand-dipped, its surface slightly uneven where each layer had cooled over the last. A scrap of paper had been folded around the base. Abigail's beeswax, poured August 1861. Willa set it upright in the chipped teacup, replacing the shorter candle that had nearly spent itself. She did not light it immediately. She trimmed the wick with the smallest of the newly found scrapers, though it felt almost ceremonial to use a hidden tool for a hidden candle. Then she struck a match. The flame shook once, then held. Beeswax gives a different light from paraffin, softer, more golden, less hungry. It filled the workroom slowly, gathering along the edge of the teak bench, touching the magnifying lens, the wrapped panels, the drawer pulls, the side of the tin box, the medal resting in its blue cloth. The room did not become bright, it became attended. Willa sat on the floor beside the stove and watched the candle burn. She did not know how to hold all that had been given into her keeping. The money frightened her, the panels frightened her more, the letter did not frighten her, but it changed the shape of the room in a way she could not yet measure. It made the studio less like property and more like a question asked across time with no demand for a quick answer. She thought of the small kindnesses that had carried her to this bench without calling themselves important. The woman with red knuckles at the Fairhaven church, who had turned off the hallway light but left the side door unlocked until morning. Ruth at the shelter, showing her how to fold a coat so the pockets stayed hidden. The janitor in Providence who had told her which streets to avoid and then pretended not to notice when she filled her bottle from the staff cooler. The bus driver outside Wareham who had waved her aboard when sleet made the road shine and her hands had gone numb around the box. Mrs. Pritchard, setting one folded bill aside in her desk drawer, as if even payment could deserve memory. Mr. Barker writing credit in a ledger for a girl who had no collateral except truth. None of them had saved her in the dramatic sense. They had not changed the whole weather. They had not mended the roof or filled the pantry or answered the deeper questions. They had only made 1 hour possible, then another, then another. Perhaps that was how most lives were carried across their narrowest places, not by rescue large enough to be named, but by careful hands appearing at the edge of the day. And maybe you remember one like that too. Maybe someone once let you sit in a warm place without asking why you had nowhere else to go. Maybe someone brought food to a door and left before thanks could make it difficult. Maybe a teacher, a neighbour, a clerk, a nurse, a stranger in a parking lot gave you one small mercy at the hour when your strength had become thinner than you wanted anyone to see. If you have such a memory, write it down somewhere. Tell it to someone who has forgotten that kindness can be small and still be real. Leave it in the comments if you can bear to. There are people listening tonight who may need to know that an ordinary act, done quietly and without applause, can become part of the bridge that carries a life forward. Willa did not speak these thoughts aloud. She only sat while the candle lowered grain by grain. When the light began to fail toward evening, she ate oats warmed over a careful fire and drank water she had boiled longer than the repair book required. Then she rewrapped the 6 panels, returned the money to the tin, and placed the medal on top of the letter, not hiding it now, only keeping it near. She spread the sweater on the floor beside the teak bench before lying down. She arranged the heirloom tools in their cloth roll and set them within reach, as Miriam might have done after a day's work. The candle burned halfway down, remained in the chipped teacup on the bench. She pinched it out with damp fingers and watched the wick send one thin thread of smoke toward the dark ceiling. The room settled around her. Outside wind moved through the walnut branches and brushed the sign above the front door. Inside, Willa lay on her side with the letter beneath her folded hands, the medal beside it, the old tools close enough to touch, and the hidden drawer open just enough to show that the secret had become shelter. She slept there without asking the house for more than one night. The first snow came on December 3 and measured 3 inches by the time Willa pushed the front door open with her shoulder. It had fallen in the night without wind, settling over the marsh grass, the broken step, the walnut roots, and the rusted corrugated sheets on the north slope of the roof. The world beyond the studio had been made simple for a few hours. Every discarded board, every coil of dead vine, every rut in the old road had accepted the same white covering. Even the condemned notice nailed to the corner post looked less official beneath its rim of snow. Inside, the basin in the north corner had skimmed over with ice. Willa broke it with the stove poker and carried it outside, careful not to spill the water across the floor. Then she stood beneath the stain and watched one slow drop form at the cracked plaster seam, fatten, tremble and fall. Roof first. Eliza's words had given order to the work, and order was a kind of mercy when money and weather could not be trusted. That morning, Willa opened the repair book to the roofing chapter and read it 3 times before lifting a hammer. She read once for sense, once for sequence, and once for the mistakes the book assumed a person would make if pride got ahead of the hand. She measured the north slope from inside where she could, then from the ground with a length of rope thrown over the ridge and marked by knots. The damaged section was 12 feet wide and nearly 9 feet from ridge to eave, but the rot ran farther beneath the metal patches than it showed from below. She drew the roof on the back of an old invoice marking the rafters, the leak, the chimney, and the place where daylight entered. At Barker & Son, Mr. Barker listened to her measurements without correcting her until she finished. Then he took the pencil and wrote his own figures beside hers. "Always buy for the waste," he said. "Yes, sir. For a roof, waste is not waste. It is where error gets forgiven." The materials filled 2 pages in the ledger. 1 bundle of asphalt shingles, weathered grey, surplus from a church repair, $6.80 against the growing account. 15 square feet of 30-pound felt, cut from a partial roll, $1.20. 2 pounds of galvanized roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, 0.76 cents. A handful of tin caps for the felt, 0.22 cents. 1 tube of roof cement with the end already crimped, 0.50 cents. A chalk line borrowed to be returned. 2 cedar shims, no charge. 1 scrap of flashing, no charge, because Mr. Barker said nobody charged a drowning person for a cup. Then he went into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet that looked older than the register. Its handle had gone dark where a hand had held it for years. One side of the head was a hammer face, the other was a sharp little blade curved by sharpening. "This was my uncle's," he said. "He roofed half the barns between here and Dartmouth before his knees gave out." Willa shook her head once. "I can't take that." "You're not taking it, you're being held accountable for returning it." She accepted it with both hands. The skilled elder arrived 2 days later in a wool cap pulled low over his ears, and a navy peacoat missing 1 button. Mr. Barker had sent him without warning. His name was Silas Rourke, 82 years old, a former roofer whose back had gone bowed but whose eyes still measured pitch and line before any tool came out. He stood in the yard and looked at the roof for a long time. "You living in there?" Willa did not dress the truth. "Yes, sir." "Then we keep water out before we make anything pretty." "I can pay a little later." "No." She looked down. Silas spat into the snow, not near her feet, only away from the conversation. Barker said, "You answer straight. That's enough." He would not take money. He would not take coffee because she had none. He accepted one bowl of oats on the 4th day, only after she made too much and said it would waste otherwise. Even then he ate standing at the open door, looking up at the roof between spoonfuls as if he did not trust it out of sight. They worked 11 days, not all full days, because December light was brief and wind made the ladder honest. Silas would not let her climb above the 2nd rung until she could tie the ladder properly at the base and brace it against a buried plank so it would not kick out. He made her practice knots with numb fingers, clove hitch, half hitch, bowline, again, hands learn cold. He said things once. If she missed them, the work taught the rest. The damaged rafters were worse than she had hoped. One had softened near the top plate, dark and punky beneath the old slate. Silas showed her how to sister it from inside, cutting a sound length of 2 by 6 to run alongside the weakened rafter, then fastening it with staggered nails, so strength travelled through the new wood without pretending the old had vanished. Do not trust one nail. No, sir. Do not crowd 3. No, sir. He marked the cut with a carpenter's square and had her saw slowly, keeping the blade just outside the line. She ruined the first end by leaning. He turned the board around and made her try again. That saw's wandering. I see it. Then bring it home. They stripped the rusted metal patch first, pulling nails one by one so the rotten sheathing would not tear farther than it had to. Underneath lay wet felt, broken shingles, mouse-chewed insulation, and a dark place where rain had been entering so long the wood smelled like soil. Silas had her remove only what needed removing. Too much demolition, he said, was a young person's way of proving despair. She learned to snap a chalk line by pinching the string between thumb and forefinger, lifting it straight and letting it strike once. A crooked line, Silas said, becomes a crooked argument repeated across a roof. She learned to lay felt from the bottom upward, each course overlapping the last so water had nowhere to argue. She learned the 3-stroke nail, set, drive, finish. Not frantic, not timid. The nail head should sit flush, not proud, not sunk. That nail's proud. She pulled it. Again. She did. Too deep. She pulled that one too. By the 7th day her hands had opened in 3 places across the knuckles. Roofing nails found every weakness in skin. Tar stuck under her nails, felt dust clung to her sleeves, the ladder bruised her shins. At night she lay on the floor and felt the roof work continuing in her shoulders, as if hammering had entered the muscle and would not leave. On the 9th day snowmelt ran down the south side cleanly and dripped from the eave instead of entering the basin. Willa did not celebrate. Silas would have mistrusted celebration before the ridge was sealed. On the 11th day, December 14th, they set the last shingle under a sky pale enough to resemble tin. Silas checked the line from the yard, then from the road, then from beneath the walnut tree. He made no grand statement. It'll shed. That was all. But inside that evening, when Willa moved the enamel basin away from the north corner for the first time, the plaster above it remained stained, cracked, and ugly. It did not drip. January made the bricks confess. After the roof held through 2 hard rains and 1 wet snow, Willa turned to the chimney with the repair book open, Mr. Barker's notes pinned under a candle stub, and Silas's warning still in her ear: water gets in above, fire punishes below. The chimney had looked merely tired from the yard, but close inspection showed the truth. 3 courses near the shoulder were spalling, their faces flaking away in thin red scales. Lower down, powdered mortar came out under her fingernail. A vertical crack ran along one joint where old Portland cement, too hard for the softer brick, had trapped moisture and made the wall fail around its own repair. Mr. Barker came to see it on a morning when the temperature stood at 24 degrees and the harbour wind carried the smell of ice and diesel. He looked up from the yard, then asked for the ladder. Willa held the base while he climbed high enough to touch the lower courses but not the roofline. "Wrong mortar," he said when he came down. She waited. "Old brick wants lime, too much cement and it can't breathe, then water stays, then winter opens it." At the store, he sold her only what he believed she could use without ruining the chimney: hydraulic lime in a half sack, fine sand, screened fireclay in a brown paper bag for the firebox joints, a narrow pointing trowel used but clean, a stiff brush, a mason's hawk with one corner dented. He wrote the ratios on a strip of cardboard. For exterior repointing, 1 part natural hydraulic lime to 2½ parts sharp sand, mixed damp, not soupy. For firebox patching, 1 part fireclay, 1 part lime, 2 parts sand, only where heat demanded it. Mist the joints before packing. Keep new work from freezing. Never smear the face of the brick to hide impatience. Mortar is not frosting, he said. Yes, sir. She worked for 3 weeks in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s. Some days the wind made the ladder sing softly against the wall, and she did only the lower joints from a safer height. Some days she worked inside, raking old mortar from the firebox with a bent screwdriver and a patience so slow it felt like penance. Every 15 minutes. Her bare fingers went numb inside the gloves because mortar work required touch and the gloves had to come off for packing, shaping and cleaning. She learned to stop before the numbness became stupidity. Hands into pockets, breathe, flex fingers until pain returned, work again. The old joints did not empty evenly. Some yielded in powder, some came out in stubborn crumbs. Some held too hard because of earlier cement and had to be left where removal would damage the brick more than the floor itself. Willa kept a notebook page for those compromises, because hidden compromises become future confusion. Inside the chimney base she cleared ash and fallen mortar from the clean-out twice more. She brushed the flue again, though less came down now. At the stove thimble she sealed a gap with the fireclay mixture and smoothed it with a wet finger, not pretty, only tight. At the rear wall she replaced 1 cracked brick she found stacked under the workbench, a salvaged brick so close in colour it might have been waiting for that place. Silas came by once and said nothing for 10 minutes. Then he pointed with his cane. Joints too fat. Willa looked. He waited. She scraped it out and did it again. Better. By then she understood his praise was measured in absence. If he did not correct it, the work might stand. Keeping the mortar from freezing was harder than mixing it. She hung old cloth inside the firebox to block drafts when the stove was cold. She warmed bricks near the stove before setting them, not hot, only above the cruelty of outdoor air. She covered exterior repairs with burlap scraps. Mr. Barker gave her from seed sacks and dampened them slightly when the wind dried the surface too fast. Cure, the book said, not dry. Willa wrote those words in the margin. Cure, not dry. Some evenings she sat with her back against the wall, listening to the chimney change as if she might hear the mortar knitting itself around sand and brick. Outside, snow hardened along the north foundation. Inside, the studio smelled of lime, wet clay, ash, wool and oats. Her hands cracked at the fingertips and bled in small, exact lines that stung when lime found them. She washed them in boiled water, wrapped them at night in cloth strips, and woke with the strips stiff. Late January brought a day of clear sun and 29 degrees. The repairs had cured as well as she could give them, the roof held, the firebox joints had set, the exterior pointing no longer marked her finger when touched. She prepared the test fire with the care of a sacrament. First a twist of paper, then dry pine splinters, then 3 thumb-thick pieces of hardwood from a broken chair Silas had told her was not worth saving. She opened the stove draft, cracked the front door for air, and held a match low. The flame moved, the paper caught, blackened, lifted. Smoke rose into the pipe, hesitated no longer than a breath, then drew upward with a steadiness she could feel in the room. She stepped outside and looked at the chimney. Smoke rose clean. Not much, just a pale thread against the winter sky, but it moved upward without rolling back along the roof. It did not leak from joints. It did not stain the room. It did not choke her out. Willa stood in the yard until the cold reached her ankles through the snow. Behind her, the old stove began to warm the room 1 honest degree at a time. The floors had been waiting under dirt, ash, salt, and the fine grey fatigue of years. Once the roof and chimney no longer demanded every hour, Willa began clearing the rooms down to their boards. The front room held wide white pine planks fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails, many darkened with age, some proud enough to catch the edge of a broom. The back workroom boards were narrower near the bench and broader near the stove, as if repairs had been made across decades with whatever lumber could be bought, salvaged or traded. She did not want new floors. New would have been easier in some places and wrong in nearly all of them. Mr. Barker agreed. These boards have already done the hard part. What is that? Stayed. The random orbit sander rented for $14 a day, and she rented it only after saving 3 dry days in a row and borrowing enough extension cord from the hardware store to reach the neighbor's exterior outlet, with permission from a man named Mr. Leduc, who owned the marine yard and said she could use power during daylight if she did not trip his freezer. The sander came in a dented black case with 3 discs of each grit and a warning label half peeled away. Mr. Barker showed her how to keep it moving before starting the motor, never resting in one place, never tipping the edge to dig out a stain. "Flaws are memory," he said. "Do not erase more than you must." She set nail heads first, one by one. She took a nail set and hammer and drove each proud rose head just below the surface. Tap, check, tap again. Some nails bent under the attempt and had to be pulled with care. The holes later filled with slivers of pine shaved from broken boards under the counter. The work took an entire day before sanding began. The first pass was 80 grit. It took off grime in soft brown curls and pale dust, revealing not clean wood at first, but wounded wood, black water stains near the north wall, grey wear at the shop entrance, a dark half-moon where generations had stood at the counter. Scratches, burns, dropped tools, heel marks, one long scar that might have been from dragging the teak bench into place. Willa did not chase every mark. The second pass was 120 grit, slower, less dramatic. The machine hummed against her hands until her wrists tingled after she turned it off. She worked with the grain where she could and feathered the transitions between newer boards and older ones. Dust collected on her eyelashes. It settled into her hair, her sleeves, the folds of her skirt, the open cracks of her knuckles. She wore a cloth over her mouth and still tasted pine for hours. The third pass was 220 grit, not because the room needed refinement, but because bare feet and dropped cloth would find any splinter she left behind. By then the boards had begun to show colour, white pine at the edges, dark honey in the centre, and near the old workbench where oil, wax and time had entered the grain, a deepening tone close to mahogany. She swept between passes, vacuumed with a borrowed shop vac, whose hose whistled through a split wrapped in tape, wiped with barely damp rags, let the dust settle overnight, and wiped again the next morning. Flaws, she learned, punished the person who believed clean meant only what the eye could see. For finish, Mr. Barker sold her tongue oil cut with citrus solvent for the first coat and boiled linseed oil for later blending. Where the older boards wanted a softer drink, he warned her about rags, heat and fire. Oily cloth could burn by its own chemistry, he said, and he made her repeat the instruction back. Lay flat outside, never pile. Again. Lay flat outside, never pile. She applied the first coat by hand with folded cloth, working in sections no wider than she could reach from her knees. The oil darkened the boards immediately, not like paint covering something, but like rain revealing stone. Pale pine became amber, amber became honey. The path before the counter turned a warm brown with red beneath it. Near the back bench, the grain rose in lines like slow water. She waited 48 hours. Then a second coat, thinner. Another 48 hours. A third rubbed nearly dry, because too much oil sits on the surface and collects dirt. She learned to judge by touch, not shine. A finished floor should not look thirsty, Mr. Barker said, but neither should it look vain. On one bad morning near the end of January, Willa woke before dawn and could not lift herself toward the work. Nothing dramatic had happened. The roof held, the chimney drew, the floor waited for a final buffing. There was oatmeal left, matches left, credit still open, and no one at the door demanding what she could not give. Yet her body remained on the sweater as if filled with sand. Her hands ached even before she used them. The thought of standing made the room tilt slightly at the edges. So she did not work. At first that felt like failure, then it felt like truth. She wrapped herself in the mended sweater and walked to the marsh carrying the tin cup with boiled water gone lukewarm. The morning was colourless, the sky and water nearly the same shade. She sat on a flat stone beyond the second walnut tree and watched the tide move through the grass. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, one leg lifted, patient beyond human instruction. It did not hurry for her benefit. It did not explain stillness. Its long neck curved, then straightened. Its eye remained fixed on water. Willa could not read. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then the heron struck. The movement was exact, swift and over before thought could follow. When it lifted its head, something small and silver flashed in its beak. The bird swallowed, settled, and became still again, as if the waiting and the taking were one unbroken act. Willa stayed until her feet went cold. Back inside. She did not apologize to the floor. She did not make up the hour. She warmed oats, washed her cup, and sat beside the stove while winter light crossed the newly oiled boards. The house had been waiting. So had she. The final buffing happened the next day. By evening, the front room no longer looked rescued. It looked remembered. The boards held their scars within the oil, not hidden, not dramatized, only kept. When she walked from the door to the counter, her footsteps sounded different, less hollow, more answered. February came with hard light and windows that told the room every weakness in the wind. There were 8 windows in all. 3 had no glass, only boards nailed across the frames from inside. 4 were cracked, each in its own pattern, 1 clean diagonal, 1 starburst near the latch, 1 corner fracture, and 1 pane held together by old tape, yellowed to the colour of weak tea. The last was original, or near enough to original that Mr. Barker became grave when he saw it. It was in the back room, south wall, above the teak bench. Wavy glass slight bubbles caught within it, a ripple that bent the marsh and walnut branches when seen from the side. The lower sash bore knife marks on the rail, and under layers of paint, the date 1788 scratched into the wood, so faintly Willa almost mistook it for damage. "Do not replace that," Mr. Barker said. "No, sir." "Do not let anyone talk you into replacing that." "No, sir. Glass like that is a witness." So the original pane stayed, and Willa learned windows as a person learns a new dialect. She removed the boarded sashes first, numbering each with pencil marks hidden along the edge, front left upper, front left lower, shop east, back west. The old sash cords had rotted to dust in some frames, leaving counterweights asleep inside the pockets. In others, the cords still held by a few threads, dangerous because they looked useful until touched. Mr. Barker sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, not nylon, because old windows were built to move with natural materials. He showed her the figure 8 knot that would hold at the counterweight without slipping, and made her tie it 6 times before letting her leave, over and under, around, back through. Dress the knot. Pull. Pretty knots fail too. She nodded. Sound knots hold. The glazing putty was DAP 33. Its skin peeled back from the top of the can to reveal dense beige putty that smelled of linseed oil and chalk. She worked it in her hands until it warmed, then rolled it into ropes against the heel of her palm. The rabbits had to be cleaned first, old putty scraped out with the chipped knife, glazing points lifted carefully, broken glass wrapped in newspaper and marked so no one would reach blindly into the trash. For the missing panes, Mr. Barker found salvaged glass from a house in Marion, being renovated by people with more money than patience. The panes were not perfect matches, but they had a slight waviness modern glass lacked. Willa measured twice, then made paper patterns because the old frames were not square. Nothing in the studio was square anymore, if it ever had been. That did not mean it could not close. She bedded each pane in a thin line of putty, pressed it gently until it seated, set glazing points with the putty knife, then ran the final bevel with a steady draw along the edge. The first bevel looked like a shoreline after a storm. She scraped it out and tried again. By the third window, her thumb knew more. The cracked panes required decisions. A crack in glass is not always a command to replace. The clean diagonal in the front room could be replaced without guilt because rain entered there. The corner fracture in the back west window could be stabilized until spring. The starburst near the latch had to go. The tape-held pane came apart in her hands as soon as she loosened the sash, and she stood very still while two pieces slid into the waiting cloth with a sound like a quiet admission. Rehanging the sashes took longer than glazing. She opened the weight pockets by prying loose painted-over trim, marking each piece so it could return to its place. Inside, the iron counterweights hung cold and black, some still tied to ghost cords, others lying at the bottom of the cavity where they had fallen years before. She cleaned the pulleys with a wire brush, oiled them lightly, and threaded new cord over the wheel, down into the pocket around the counterweight, secured with the figure-8 knot. Then came the careful balancing. A sash should not slam down. It should not drift up like a nervous thought. It should rise when lifted and stay where placed. She adjusted knots, shortened one cord, lengthened another, and learned that 1/8 of an inch could change the whole behavior of a window. The original 1788 window she saved for last because fear had made her wise enough not to begin there. She cleaned its frame with warm water and a cloth, not scraping where paint held history better than cleanliness could. The putty around that pane had cracked but not failed entirely. She removed only the loose sections, leaving sound material where it still performed its duty. At the lower right corner, she pressed new DAP 33 into place with the smallest putty knife, feathering it into the old bevel until the repair did not announce itself. Outside, on a walnut branch beyond the glass, a chickadee landed. It was so small that for a moment Willa did not move. The bird clung to the branch. Black cap, neat body, round against the cold, feet delicate on bark that had outlived whole households. It turned its head once, quick and exact, looking through the repaired window into the room where Willa stood with putty on her thumb and cold light across her hands. Then it hopped along the branch and flew. Willa looked through the old glass after it. The world beyond bent slightly in the waviness, marsh grass trembling sky-pale, walnut limbs curved by the pane's imperfect memory. The view was not accurate in the modern sense. It was truer than that. It showed what time did to light when no one replaced it. By the end of February's first week, all 8 windows closed. Not perfectly. The studio had lived too long for perfect, but the front room no longer breathed through broken panes. The back room held warmth an hour longer after the stove went low. Rain struck glass and stayed outside. Morning entered not in blades through boards, but in softened rectangles across the floor. Willa saved every piece of old glass that came out whole. She wrapped the shards that could not be saved and placed them aside for proper disposal. She cleaned the sills with oil soap, patched one rotten corner with fitted wood, and left small flaws visible where fixing them would have required removing more history than weather demanded. On the last evening of that section of work, she opened each window 1 inch, then closed it again, listening to the pulley cords move over their wheels. Rise, hold, lower, settle. The room answered with a gentler silence than before. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, Willa finished the first piece that could honestly leave her hands. She did not finish it in triumph. Nothing about the work allowed for that. It ended on a Thursday afternoon while wet snow moved sideways beyond the south window and the stove gave off a low iron heat from the corner. The piece lay under the magnifying lens on a square of folded linen, small enough to rest in her palm, modest enough that someone passing quickly might have mistaken it for an old button or a fragment of handled bone. It was tagua nut, lawful and clean, polished patiently with pumice until the surface held light without glare. She had practiced for months on scraps that went wrong in quiet ways. Lines pressed too deep, borders crowded, ink staining where it should have lifted, a ship's mast made stiff by fear instead of true by attention. Those pieces remained in a shallow box beneath the bench, not hidden, not displayed. They had taught what they could. This one was different. On its pale oval face she had engraved the second walnut tree, the horseshoe half swallowed by bark, and the low roof line of the studio behind it. No ship, no whale, No grand harbour scene borrowed from a century she could not claim without caution. Only the place that had taken her in and asked her to become careful. She mixed the ink in a stone cup, 1 part lampblack with gum Arabic water, warmed gently near the stove, and waited the full 9 minutes before wiping. Miriam's old lesson steadied her wrist. Eliza's instructions steadied the rest. When the surface cleared, the image remained. Fine, honest, kept. Willa sat back and let the lens swing away. The studio around her had changed, though not in any way that would impress a magazine. The roof did not leak, the chimney drew clean, the windows rose and held where placed. The floors shone in a dark honey colour that deepened near the bench and softened toward the front door. The plaster still bore old waves, small unevennesses that caught lamplight at dusk. Shelves had been scrubbed, repaired, and returned to use. The glass display case held lawful materials, repair samples, a handwritten notice about ethical sourcing, and one small card that read, "No new whale ivory, no exceptions." The front room had a chair by the counter for people who needed to sit before speaking. Willa had learned that many did. The back room remained the heart. The teak bench carried tools in ordered rows, cotton cloths folded in a tin, pumice wrapped in paper, bottles labelled by hand, and the chipped teacup still holding dull points as her father had used it. Above the bench, the 1788 glass bent winter light into something older than accuracy. The money had not made the place large. It had made time possible. That winter, the brass key still sat on the mantel. She had found it in the first year, in the small oak box wedged beneath a loose stairboard to the cellar, beside a tintype photograph dated summer 1903. In the picture stood a young woman with Willa's face and a calmer mouth, one hand resting against the studio door frame, the other holding a fine-pointed graver. On the back, in narrow ink, someone had written, "Clara Mercy Bell, daughter of Samuel's brother, aged 25, summer of 1903. The key's bow was shaped like a tiny whale's tail, though worn enough that only a person who knew the trade might see it. For a long time, Willa did not look for its lock. Some things deserved to remain unanswered until the hand had become worthy of the next question. She dusted around the key, moved it when cleaning the mantel, and set it back where the stove glow could find the brass. It became less a mystery than a companion. Then, on the morning after finishing the walnut tree piece, she went outside to bring in firewood and saw that the second walnut had shed a section of loose bark during the night storm. The fallen bark lay in the snow at the base of the tree, curved like a dark plate behind where it had been, just below the old horseshoe and nearly level with Willa's shoulder. A small green stain marked the trunk. Not moss, not lichen, verdigris. She brushed snow from her sleeve and leaned closer. Set into the living wood, almost entirely grown over, was a brass plate no larger than the palm of her hand. The tree had folded itself around the edges across decades, holding the metal without swallowing the keyhole at its centre. The keyhole was dark and narrow, rimmed in green. Willa went back inside without hurry. She took the brass key from the mantel, warmed it in her hand, and returned to the tree. The key entered with resistance, then settled. She turned it slowly. For a moment nothing moved. Then something inside the trunk released with a sound so small it might have been a twig breaking under snow. A section of wood, shaped and disguised with patient craft, loosened along a seam. Willa eased it open. Inside the tree was a cavity lined with old tin, dry as a drawer. Within it lay a folded flag and a note wrapped in oilcloth. The flag came first. She recognized the pattern after a breath. 48 stars, folded with a care that made the cloth hold its shape even after long hiding. The colours had dimmed but not failed. The white had gone cream. The red had deepened toward rust. It smelled faintly of cedar, metal, and the protected dark. The note was dated April 9th, 1945. A real war year. The year men were still dying in Europe. The year families listened to radios with their hands held too tightly in their laps. The year letters could arrive with either life or its ending folded inside. The handwriting was different from Eliza's, broader and less formal. To the one who keeps the house after me. My name is Clara Mercy Bell Whitcomb. I am not well enough to climb ladders now, but I am still well enough to hide a thing properly. This flag belonged to my son Daniel, who carried it in his sea bag before shipping out with the Navy in 1942. He came home alive, though not unchanged, and asked me to keep the flag here because he said the house had held more grief than any church he knew and might know what to do with one more folded cloth. If war takes him later, remember him kindly. If peace keeps him, remember the ones it did not. Do not sell this flag. Do not display it for vanity. Let it breathe on days when the country remembers its dead, and then fold it away again. A thing can be honoured without being exposed forever. The key is shaped for the old trade because this house opens only to careful hands. CMBW. Willa read the note beside the tree while snow gathered on the shoulders of her coat. The cold did not hurry her. The walnut stood still under the pale sky, holding its iron, its brass, its hidden tin, its long memory of women who had trusted wood more than public record. She carried the flag and note inside, laid them on the workbench, and washed her hands before touching them again. The medal from 1918 had already found its day of daylight. On Memorial Day, May 27, 2024, Willa had taken it to Rural Cemetery in New Bedford, where so many names lay under stone, some known by family, some known only by the dates that history had left behind. She did not know with certainty where Nathaniel Samuel Bell rested, because war had a way of scattering bodies and records, and the documents in the cache gave only enough truth to ache over. But she found the veterans section stood near the older markers and held the medal in her open palm while flags moved in the grass. She did not make a speech. She read his name once from the back of the medal. She read the year. She placed no claim upon his life. Then she wrapped the medal again in blue cloth and brought it home, because Eliza had not asked for spectacle. She had asked that it see daylight once in a while. That was enough. The money remained mostly untouched. Willa spent slowly, exactly as the letter had instructed: roof first, chimney second, sills before paint, food before pride, law before desire. She paid Mr. Barker every Friday, sometimes in dollars, sometimes in work when he let her sharpen stock knives or sort brass screws by size behind the counter. She bought oats, beans, lamp oil, stove wood when scavenged wood ran low, and the materials that kept weather outside where it belonged. From the old coins she spent only 4. One worn mercury dime paid for the first packet of lawful Tagua samples from a supplier in Rhode Island. 1 wheat penny, too common for collectors but meaningful to her, she kept in her apron pocket until the day she bought new cotton cloths, then placed it in the register at the hardware store because beginning again should cost something real. 1 Walking Liberty $half went toward the first notice she printed on heavy cream paper explaining the studio's repair work. 1 silver dollar, after long consideration, paid the filing fee for a small business registration under the name already painted above the door. The rest she sealed again. Not in the same false bottom that belonged to the past and had done its work. She placed the remaining bills, coins, documents, and a careful accounting in a new tin, wrapped in oilcloth, and stored it where damp could not reach and greed would not think to look. On the top sheet she wrote, "For the next one, use slowly." The 6 engraved panels did not become hers in the ordinary way either. After months of letters, appointments, and 2 visits from a maritime historian whose gloves were cleaner than his shoes, they were placed on long-term loan with a museum in New Bedford under conditions Willa had written twice and signed once. The studio would retain the story of their finding. The museum would conserve them, study them, and show them only with language that told the full truth. Skill, grief, wailing, harm, labour, memory, and the people left ashore. When the first panel was carried out in its padded case, Willa stood at the doorway and touched the frame, not because she regretted letting it go, but because parting should be done awake. The shop reopened quietly. There was no banner, no article, no ribbon cut by a councilman with polished shoes. Willa wrote 1 index card in black ink and carried it to the cafe near the marine supply shop. Doris, the owner, pinned it to the corkboard between a church supper notice and a card advertising accordion lessons. Harbour bone and ivory. Ethical Scrimshaw-style engraving and small heirloom repair. Lawful materials only. By appointment. South Water Street, past the old rope walk. At first people came because they were curious. Then they came because somebody told them she listened before touching what they brought. A cracked bone-handled letter opener from a grandfather's desk, a sailor's palm needle case with a name nearly worn away, a tagua pendant for a woman whose daughter had moved west and wanted something small enough to mail, a memorial border around initials on a piece of antique piano key scrap, legal, documented, and carried in by a man who cried only after Willa turned away to give him privacy. By the end of the second winter, the mailing list held 43 names. Most were written on loose cards in a recipe box behind the counter. Some wanted repair, some wanted to know when she would teach a Saturday class on lawful materials and old methods. Some only wanted a note mailed when the shop opened in spring after the worst cold passed. Willa wrote every address by hand because typing them felt too quick. On a clear afternoon in late January, the teenage boy came back. He had been younger when she first noticed him splitting wood near the walnut trees during the restoration months, arriving on a Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars, and a seriousness that made him seem older until he smiled. His name was Caleb. He had refused money then because his mother had told him about Willa's grandfather, though she had not known the details and he had not asked for them. Now he was taller, almost grown into his wrists, with sawdust on his jacket and a shy pride he tried to hide by looking at the ground. He carried something wrapped in an old quilt. "I made it," he said. Willa cleared the counter. He laid the bundle down and unfolded the cloth. The sign was carved from walnut, not the living tree, he told her quickly, but a storm-fallen limb from his uncle's place in Rochester. The letters were hand-cut and a little uneven, though in the way living letters should be. He had copied the old sign's shape, its spacing, its stubborn plainness. Harbour bone and ivory. Scrimshaw and repair. And daughters. The last words were smaller. Plural. Willa looked at them for a long time. Caleb shifted his weight. "I can fix that part if it's wrong." "No," she said. Her voice sounded different in the room. Not loud, not broken, only exact. "It is not wrong." He had not varnished it too heavily. The walnut still showed its grain. Tool marks remained inside the letters where the chisel had turned. A professional sign-maker might have smoothed those away. Caleb had left them, whether from instinct or lack of patience, and Willa was grateful for both. They hung it on a Saturday with Mr. Barker holding the ladder, Silas Rourke sitting in a chair below to offer corrections no one had requested, and Doris from the cafe bringing coffee in paper cups and pretending she had only been passing. The old sign remained beneath the new one, not covered, not discarded. The building could carry both. When Caleb climbed down, Silas looked up at the plural word and gave one slow nod. "That'll weather." From him it was praise enough to last years. That night, after everyone had gone, and the road had become dark beyond the windows, Willa sat at the teak bench with a clean sheet of paper before her. The stove burned low, the 48-star flag rested folded in its cloth-lined box. Eliza's letter lay beside it, no longer fragile from neglect, only fragile because all paper is. Clara's note sat beneath the brass key. Jonah's knife rested to the right of Willa's hand, sharpened but not hurried. She dipped the pen. For a long moment she did not write. Inheritance had become less mysterious by then, and more demanding. It was not the secret in the drawer, not the money, not even the tools, though each had mattered. It was the obligation to leave a path legible enough for a stranger in need, and humble enough not to command what that stranger must become. At last she wrote the first line. "My dear one, whoever you are." She stopped there and let the ink dry. There would be time for the rest. She would write about the roof and the chimney, about Mr. Barker's ledger, about Silas's terse lessons, about Ruth at the shelter and the bus driver in Sleat. She would write the laws around materials as plainly as she could. She would write where the money was kept, what had been spent, what must not be sold, and which floorboard near the front display case still needed a careful step when the weather turned damp. She would write that being cast out was not the same as being ended. She would write that the world misprices what is patient. But not all in one night. The candle burned with a steady flame. Outside, snow had begun again, light and deliberate, softening the ruts in the old road. The walnut tree stood beyond the window, holding its horseshoe, its hidden brass, its scars, its rings, its patient record of storms. Willa folded the unfinished page once and set it beneath the paperweight. Then she rose, checked the stove door, touched the workbench with the flat of her hand, and looked toward the front room where the new sign waited outside in the dark. A Scrimshaw studio waits. It has always waited. Across town in the county clerk's office, one folded dollar bill still lay in the back of Mrs. Pritchard's desk drawer, pressed beneath a stack of old receipt books and a map with blue corrections. The clerk had meant to reconcile it that first evening, and then had not. Later, perhaps, she had chosen to let it remain. Money usually passes through hands too quickly to remember them. This one stayed, and on quiet afternoons when the office emptied and the brass stamp rested in its cradle, Mrs. Pritchard would sometimes open the drawer, see the folded bill, and think of a girl with a cardboard box who had bought a condemned building for the exact amount printed in the notice. She never told anyone. Some stories do not need public witness to become true. They only need a door left unlocked, a name written carefully, a tool kept sharp, and a house patient enough to wait for the next hand.